Hello, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you very
Hello.
much for being with us on this very important day. On the 27th of January, there is another reason for the international community to pay a tribute to the victims of the Holocaust, one of the most brutal and massive crimes against humanity in the history. But for many people in the world, no special day or date is needed to remember the Holocaust, especially for you, Mr. Ambassador. You are a son of the 91-year-old Holocaust survivor. Could you please tell us your father's story and when and how you were told this story? How does your family live with it?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I'm talking to you right now from my parents' apartment in Tel Aviv. I arrived in Israel in order to get vaccinated, so I'm staying with my 91-year-old father and my 78-year-old mother. My father was born in Hungary, but his family moved all over Eastern Europe, Eastern and Central Europe during the 30s. And then when the war started, first they were captured by the Nazis, and then in the so-called liberated territories by the Russians. So they suffered both from the Nazis and from the advancing Russian army. My father was born in 1929, so when the war started, he was 10 years old. And they were moved from camp to camp, from ghetto to ghetto, and basically he was a child during the Holocaust. He lost most of his relatives in the gas chambers, in the killing fields, and there were two main reasons why my father, his sister, and their parents survived. The first reason was that my father had blonde hair and blue eyes, so he didn't have the stereotypical Jewish look, but rather the stereotypical Aryan look, and that sometimes endeared him to the German soldiers. The other reason was that my grandmother, my father's mother, was a very good cook, so the commander of the camp took her as a personal cook, and she managed to smuggle potatoes and garlic for the children. And garlic is a natural immunizer. So many people were sick and indeed perished because of typhoid and typhus and the other epidemics. But thanks to the consumption of garlic, my father's family was more resistant to diseases. After the war was finished, they went back to Hungary, but of course there was even more anti-Semitism in Hungary after the war than before. So then they decided that they had no place, there was no place for them in Europe, and they decided to move to Israel. And he arrived in Israel in 1948, the year when the State of Israel was established. He was 19 years old.
So how many years did he spend in those camps?
Well, basically, he was in the camps for the duration of the Second World War.
I see. He saw all this brutality and
absolutely, absolutely. Even today, he wakes up at least once or twice a week, screaming in his sleep. He still has nightmares. The kind of childhood memories, childhood traumas that you experience never fade away.
That's true. And I asked you also, how does your family live with it, you personally? What is your personal experience of learning about Holocaust from the survivor and living with it?
I will give you a very frank and sincere answer. When you are born and raised in Israel, as I have been, you are always surrounded by Holocaust-related narratives. You learn about it at school, you hear it from family members, there are films, there are plays, there are books about it. So it's impossible not to be aware of the collective memory of the Holocaust, and sometimes Israelis such as myself who were born in Israel went to the army, and we never experienced being helpless or being victimized. We only have an experience of being strong, independent, and self-sufficient. So people like me sometimes reject the Holocaust. We find the memory of the Holocaust even a little bit embarrassing. But all of that changed. First of all, when I visited the camps, I went to Auschwitz and Treblinka and other places.
How old were you?
Oh, I was already a diplomat.
Okay.
But the more significant change for me was when I became a father. The moment I had my first daughter was born, and I was 33, suddenly I had a helpless person to look after. And to me, the thought that over 1 million children were murdered in the Holocaust, tiny little helpless innocent creatures, that was completely incomprehensible. So only then did I come to terms with the fact that my own father was himself a child during the Holocaust. So it's very much a personal issue, but I know that many of my generation have only really connected to the memory of the Holocaust through their own family associations.
I see. As I understand, the Holocaust is much more than a remembrance of a historically one of the most horrifying and important experiences, but it's something that the whole Jewish nation lives with. Could you please explain why is that important, the Holocaust, to be remembered and understood well enough by everyone in the world, not only by Jewish nation?
Absolutely, and this is the most important issue. This is the crux of the matter. For us, Jews, Israelis, of course, the Holocaust is important, first of all, because we lost half of our nation. It's simply incomprehensible that 1/2 of our nation disappears in the space of 6 years. So virtually every family has lost some relatives, and we still grieve the missing half of our nation that perished. Secondly, the State of Israel was established in 1948, only 3 years after the end of the Second World War and the Holocaust. So we established a state with refugees, basically people like my father who arrived here at the age of 19 with nothing except the clothes on their backs. And they established a state which is now thriving and prosperous. A state that was built by Holocaust refugees and refugees from Middle Eastern countries as well. Thirdly, our main lesson for Israelis and Jews is that this will never be allowed to happen again. We will never accept any form of anti-Semitism or any attempt to endanger the life of Israelis, which is why we are so vigilant, for example, about the attempts of Iran to acquire a nuclear bomb. But the other point which you refer to in your question is the lesson for the wider world, not just the Jews.
Universal lesson, yeah.
Absolutely. Anti-Semitism is a pernicious form of racism. But basically in the Holocaust, we saw not just the Jews being exterminated. The Jews were the largest group to be exterminated, but also gypsies and also people who suffered from mental diseases and people who were mentally backwards and of course homosexuals. So basically in the Holocaust, everyone who was different was subjugated, persecuted, and exterminated. And the lesson today, especially now that we see what is happening around the world, we see attempts at genocide at different places. Even as we speak now, we see racism, xenophobia, homophobia, discrimination and violence against women.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. And one would have thought that in the 21st century, this would be confined to the history books. But unfortunately, we see all of those negative phenomena on the rise. So the main lesson for the world is that you should never turn a blind eye. You should never ignore some racist or xenophobic statement and say, well, it's just one statement. Because if you ignore it now, then a year or two down the road, you will have to deal with the repercussions, which will be much more significant and difficult to deal with.
Mr. Ambassador, was that the reason several weeks ago you reacted sharply on the anti-Semitic theories expressed by the Georgian deacon? Those theories, you noted in your statement, were reminiscent of some of the worst blood libels and anti-Jewish hate propaganda of 1930s Europe. Why did you make a decision to react that boldly on this particular case? And what do you think you had to secure with your reaction?
Well, first of all, I have to say that I think I know Georgia and Georgian society reasonably well, because this is my second time in Georgia. I was posted to Georgia between 1997 and 2000 for 3 years, and now I'm back as ambassador. So I have dozens and dozens of Georgian friends of different backgrounds, walks of life, and I can say definitely and without any reservation that anti-Semitism almost doesn't exist in Georgia. It's a very, very rare phenomenon. And Georgia has been a welcoming home for the Jewish people for over 2 millennia.
And Georgians are proud of that.
Absolutely, and for good reason.
But still there exists something, I don't know what is that, stereotypes. Is that something that is left with us from the Soviet era? Or some stigmas? I don't know. I think about that very often. Please continue. I interrupted you.
No. Yes, the thing is that when we encounter an anti-Semitic statement, and it doesn't matter whether it was intentional or unintentional or based on ignorance, we can't ignore it, because if we ignore it now, it will spread. It will spread like the COVID virus. You have to deal with it when it's still small. Now, first there was one statement coming out of Kutaisi, a very senior member of the Orthodox Church, and then I tried to deal with it discreetly and diplomatically. But then less than 2 weeks later came another statement which was even worse, and I was hoping that there would be condemnations or rejections from senior members of the Georgian establishment. But when I saw that there was some hesitancy, I had no choice but to publish my own statement. Now, Jews have been persecuted throughout history, always based on the same 3 or 4 stereotypes. And one of them is that Jews love money, Jews are avaricious and greedy, and Jews have disproportionate power. Jews control the central banks of the United States, Great Britain, the European Union, and behind every bank or banker or rich merchant, there's a Jew lurking. And of course, Jews all over the world are coordinating their efforts in order to maximize the benefits for Jews.
Yeah, familiar ones, stereotypes.
The most famous or infamous text that enshrined those stereotypes is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that was created in Tsarist Russia in the 19th century, and since then have been printed and reprinted, and there were all sorts of variations. But the stereotypes have remained the same for almost 2 millennia. And unfortunately, those stereotypes crept up in those statements that we've seen recently from Kutaisi, that the Jews basically are rich, they are manipulating the leadership, the international governments, in order to maximize benefits for themselves at the expense of non-Jews. Now, the other thing is that sometimes people say, well, it's not my view. I simply quoted what is in the Holy Testament or the scriptures. Saint Ambrosius said it. It wasn't me. Well, we live in an age of social media, where if you take one quote out of context, then it gets a completely different meaning. I could be saying, well, it's not me who's calling for the extermination of all Jews, it's only Hitler. I was merely quoting Mein Kampf, it wasn't me. But the context matters. It's one thing if you quote it within an academic discussion, and another thing if you deliver a sermon to a congregation in church full of hundreds of people. So the context makes all the difference, and this is why, unfortunately, I had no choice but to respond very strongly.
We must, you said, we must all join forces in order to isolate and marginalize the extremists, the racists and the xenophobes. Do you think it's about isolation and marginalizing rather than education?
Well, no, education is actually the key component. You're absolutely right. But education takes time. And education is a very lengthy process that starts from a very young age. And the problem is that, again, today, children and even adults, they get most of their information not from school, but from the internet, and not just a respectable, reliable, serious website, but from Twitter, from all sorts of fringe websites and fake news, basically. So there's not only one channel of education or information as there used to be 20, 30 years ago, but there's an explosion in information. And we've seen with the global pandemic now that sometimes it's almost impossible to separate fact from myth, what is true and what is not. So how can we expect an 8-year-old child to be able to do that? So education is very important, but when we see important influential people in positions of authority, either government or social positions or religious positions, who are making outrageous comments, they have to be dealt with immediately and isolated and marginalized. And it's not only the xenophobes and the racists and the anti-Semites, it's basically anyone who refuses to accept the other. And the other can be someone of a different skin color, different religion, or different sexual preference. Anyone who is other than different than us. If we don't embrace whoever is different, how can we promote democracy and diversity?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you think you got your statement, your protest got proper answer, proper reaction? There was a comment from the Minister for Foreign Affairs, some other comments also. Do you think it was enough at the moment?
At this moment, and hopefully, if there are no similar statements that we're going to see in the near future, then I'm happy to leave it behind me, the entire incident, because as you said, I reacted very forcefully, and since then, the Israeli embassy in Tbilisi has been showered, inundated with expressions of sympathy, empathy, and support from ordinary Georgian people, as well as members of the government and the higher institutions. Not only the government, you mentioned Foreign Minister Zalkalyani, but also public defender and many, many others. So in a paradoxical kind of way, those two outrageous statements only served to reinforce the friendship and the empathy between our two nations. So for now, I'm happy to leave it behind us, and hopefully there will be no similar statements or provocations in the future, because as I started off by saying, there's hardly any anti-Semitism in Georgia, and hopefully there never will be.
You hoped also to get some reaction from the Patriarch of Georgia. Did you get any?
Well, I've been in touch with very, very senior members of the Patriarchate, and they reassured me that the Patriarch was fully aware not only of the outrageous statements that unfortunately had been made, but also the strong reaction that was made by again, members of the church. There were the Metropolitan of Kutaisi published a rebuttal and a clarification of his first statement, and then there was another statement published, I think, by Bishop Shio. I'm sorry if I don't remember the exact attribution right now, but I've been assured several times that the Patriarch is keeping very close eye on what is happening and regrets very much what's been happening. Obviously, the Patriarch is not in the best of health right now, so I didn't really expect him to appear on TV and make a personal statement, although, of course, it would have been welcome.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for your very frank answers. You mentioned pandemic several times during this interview, though it's not the topic of our conversation now. But I just want to ask you the question is short and I'm not sure about the answer. How have you managed, Israel, to organize the vaccination campaign that successfully?
Well, Israel has some advantages, luckily, that maybe some other countries, even bigger, richer, wealthier countries than Israel don't have. And first of all, we are small. We're a tiny little country. We are much smaller than Georgia geographically. And even though our population is bigger than the Georgian population, it's 9.2 million, it's concentrated in a very small piece of land, so it's easily reachable. It's not like Georgia with the remote, rural, mountainous areas. But secondly, and most importantly, we have a system of national health system. It's a public system of clinics that was established even before the State of Israel was created by the socialist founding fathers of the State of Israel. I know nowadays socialism has a very bad name, and we associate socialism with everything that is bad with society. But the founding fathers of the State of Israel were socialists, and they created free-for-all public healthcare system that is considered the best in the world. And this is not just my opinion, it's been pronounced to be the best in the world by leading experts. So, for example, the Israeli public healthcare system was the first one to go digital already more than 20 years ago, which means that every person who gets vaccinated in Israel, the entire data, the information is immediately fed into the system that can analyze the side effects, the allergies, the potential risks for other population groups. Yeah, so this is why we managed to achieve what we have.
What about the will of the population?
Yes,
it should be totally voluntary, right?
It's absolutely voluntary. It's absolutely voluntary, and so far we've vaccinated almost a third of the population. Not everyone shows the same extent of willingness. We two groups within the Israeli population are a little bit reluctant. One group is the Israeli Arabs. They are Israeli citizens of Arab ethnicity. They are less confident or trustful of the campaign, and the other group is the very, very religious Orthodox Jews who have less access to the internet. They're very religious, very devout, and they get their information mostly from their rabbis. So the government is working hand in hand very closely with those spiritual leaders in order to encourage them to get themselves vaccinated.
I see. Thank you very much for sharing that experience also with us. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you for inviting me.
It was a great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you.